What I would hope is that the book unsettles people and that they go away thinking and interrogating their own behavior, their own thought patterns.
Karen Jennings is here to talk about her new novel, An Island, which was a long-listed finalist for the Booker Prize.
War is the most morally fraught thing that we can do as a nation, and it demands more democratic accountability.
Phil Klay, a Marine Corps veteran and acclaimed fiction writer, joins us to talk about a new collection of his nonfiction, Uncertain Ground: Citizenship in an Age of Endless, Invisible War. And the Times' critics Dwight Garner and Alexandra Jacobs join us to talk about books they've recently reviewed. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's June 3rd. I'm John Williams. Karen Jennings is a poet and a fiction writer. Her first novel published in the United States is An Island. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize last year, and Karen joins us from her home in South Africa to talk about it. Hi, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
In the book review, Lydia Millett called the book beautifully and sparingly constructed, and she said, "No plot summary can do justice to a story woven this carefully." We're going to try anyway. Give us a little bit of a sense of what the plot of the book is.
Oh, well, now that you've just said that's impossible to do, you've given me an impossible task. It is a novel that's set on a fictional island somewhere that is unnamed, so that there is a sense of universality to it. And the action of the novel is quite limited. It all takes place on this island where Samuel is an old man. He's a lighthouse keeper there, and he's been living there for a long time, and he's got his home, he's got his routine, it's his safe place. And then right at the start of the novel, what happens is that a refugee washes up on the shore, and he's unsettled by this. He is upset that there is this threat to his peace. And what happens is, as he begins to interact with this man, he begins to have memories of quite traumatic events throughout his life on the mainland, from his childhood through to his time as a political prisoner, and then to when he came to the island.
And so Samuel came to the island, I think, 23 years ago. Is that right? He's been there for that long?
Yes, so certainly more than 2 decades, a long time.
And what is his normal interaction with people? There's just a supply boat that comes by every so often. Is that the only time he sees other people?
Yes. It's about once a fortnight that the supply boat comes, and he's really isolated, and he's got his little garden. He's got his chickens. He's very fond of his chickens. And the island, I suppose, is his friend. There is no other human company for him. And so it is quite upsetting for him to have this threat of the refugee, who's also a younger man, and they don't speak the same language. So communication is quite difficult, and he doesn't trust the refugee.
The opening scene of the book, I have to say, is one of the more gripping ones I've read recently. It involves the refugee washing up on shore, and what Samuel tells us is that this has happened many times, but that the refugees have always been, unfortunately, dead when they wash up on shore. And he believes that this refugee is at first as well, but then realizes that he's in fact barely alive. Was that scene one of the first things that came to you? I don't want to be reductive, but it's so striking that I wonder if it was one of the first things you thought of in terms of setting the story in motion and how this story came to you.
Well, the story, I suppose, did in one sense come to me like that. What happened was I was at a writer's residency in Denmark. I had finished writing a draft of a different novel. I am a great believer in naps. I have a nap every day just after lunch. And so I went for my normal nap. And just before I went to sleep, I thought, oh, I wonder what I will write next. And then it came, I suppose one can call it a dream or a vision, of this old black man on an island looking very angry. And so I had this, I suppose, a vision of the island, the lighthouse, Samuel, and of someone coming in. And I wasn't quite sure who it was, but definitely of someone coming in and being a threat, but then that threat not coming in on a boat armed with machetes and AK-47s or anything like that, it being a very subtle kind of threat. So the muse doesn't visit me in that kind of way for all my projects. I was quite fortunate that it did happen that way for me.
The power of a nap.
Yeah.
The story has been called fable-like and allegory-like. There is something spare to it, stripped back, but you do go back, as you mentioned, to Samuel's past. He has these memories of his time. There's two segments of time. One is as a younger man involved with this political uprising, and then time that he spent, a good amount of time that he spent in prison. How much of that was initially going to be in the book? How much did you have to pare away? There's a highly condensed sense of getting a lot of information, but in a fairly slender book, you cover all of this territory. Was that always going to be the shell for it?
Yeah, I knew from the start that it needed to be a small book in the sense of the size, that it wasn't going to be long. I did quite a lot of research. I wanted to go back to the history of colonialism within Africa in general. So go back to the time of the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, 1890s, where the powers in Europe, there's a famous cartoon of them slicing up the cake of Africa and handing out slices to the different powers. So I wanted to look at that and what the effect and influence of that would have been on one individual. That might not be the way it was for everyone. This is just an experiment, an attempt to try and understand it through one person. But I wanted to take this very complex issue, like colonialism, like an entire continent, and really focus my attention on that as best as I could. And I knew that if I were to write about any one specific country, then I would have to make it about that country's political events, that country's culture. That wasn't what my plan was. My plan was to make it more universal, in attempt to understand something greater, something more complex. And the only way that I could see to do that was to do it in this very pared down, focused way, reducing most of the action to this fictional island and then to these brief moments, these, I guess, kind of like highlights from Samuel's past.
It does have that feeling of a parable of sorts, despite the many details that we get about Samuel's past and that he comes alive in that way. But it's interesting because you talk about not wanting to specify it because then you'd have to do, it would be maybe more limiting in some way to your purposes. You've also written and spoken elsewhere about the idea, the very contemporary idea of appropriation. And I always felt Samuel as somewhat of a universal figure. You mentioned him being an old black man, but I'm not sure that's even mentioned in the book. How did you feel about being careful around that idea of sort of adopting his perspective?
I was quite careful in the book in a number of ways. So I didn't want to specify what anyone looked like. I'm not sure what it's like in America, but in South Africa at school, we studied history and we studied the Second World War and the Holocaust. And we looked at the way that the Nazis, they had these posters of how to spot a Jew. And I was thinking, I really don't want to fall into that kind of trap where I describe the refugee in one kind of way, and then that people can say, oh, well, that refugee is definitely from this country, or that's how people from one country see people from another country. Because within Africa, there is a lot of xenophobia. There is a lot of anger and violence within South Africa. We have xenophobic riots from time to time. At the moment, there's an upsurge of xenophobia, people going out and looking at people that they consider to not look a certain way. So I wanted to be very careful about not encouraging that kind of thinking. And there is one part where Samuel talks to an official and she says, but what does he look like? Describe these features to me. And he doesn't do that. I really didn't want him to do that. I didn't want to fall into that trap. In terms of being a white South African writing, and I'm a woman writing an old Black African man, of course, that was a concern for me. I think it would be foolish to deny that. And I did grapple with this with my very first novel that was published in 2012. That was written about a fishing community on the west coast of South Africa. And in South Africa, we have different racial cultural groups. So we have the group that's called colored, which I know in America is considered a pejorative term, but here it's a proud cultural group. And so I was writing, some of my characters were colored, and I began to feel so concerned about speaking for them or worrying about appropriation that I gave no characters any names. There was no dialogue. Everyone was just she and he. And it became such a mess, that manuscript, because I was not able to do anything. And I was being so careful that there was no point to it in the end. And so I had to say to myself, as long as I'm aware and trying to be sensitive and am aware that some people will inevitably get offended, no matter how hard I try, I have to do my best. It's my job as an author to try to understand, to try to see the ways of the world, of people, to make sense of it. So that was the same kind of thing that I've carried through to an island, where I tried to write with sensitivity. I am sure that there are people that have problems with what I've written, and I am very open to talking to them, to hearing what it is that they felt I've done wrong or what they would have liked to see done differently, because that's how we get better. That's how we learn about ourselves, about the world, and no one is perfect and no one ever will be perfect.
I think there is a quality to the narration and the ideas that you're wrestling with that does make it seem universal, which helps with that feeling of you're not trying to speak for one specific person's perspective. I think you're trying to capture what is sort of human about all of these issues. And they're big issues in addition to colonialism, which you discussed. I mean, obviously, the crisis of refugees is, I think, probably the moral quandary at the center of this book, because essentially Samuel's current day predicament is that he's reacting fearfully to this person. He doesn't know how he should treat him. He wrestles with himself about how to treat him. It's not a didactic book, but what inspired you about current debates around that issue, and what did you want to show, even in a shaded way, about the ways that we morally position ourselves with regards to refugees?
I would like to think it's not didactic. I'd like to think that I'm not trying to beat anyone over the head with some kind of lesson. What I would hope is that the book unsettles people and that they go away thinking and interrogating their own behavior, their own thought patterns. After the vision that I had during my very powerful nap, there was also in the news at the time, there was the Syrian refugee crisis. This was in 2015. And so there were the different responses that I was seeing in Europe to let's help the refugees, let's give them a home, welcome them in. And we see the same thing happening with Ukrainian refugees right now, where they're being welcomed, whereas refugees from Africa, their boats are being turned away. They're not welcome. They're not wanted. And this is a problem. I'm not saying that Syrian refugees or Ukrainian refugees do not deserve to be helped or given any kind of support. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there is definitely a difference in the way that refugees from certain places are treated. So then I was thinking about that reaction to refugees, and then I was thinking about it within Africa, and specifically the experiences I've seen in South Africa. As I've mentioned, there's been a lot of xenophobia with people, sometimes even it being instigated or encouraged by officials in the government who say that the reason there are not enough jobs is because foreigners and refugees have come in and taken all the jobs. And so this is what we are seeing now, where there are these vigilante groups that go around and they will hunt out Zimbabweans or Malawians or Ethiopians or whatever it is. Sometimes they will kill them. Recently, I think there were 7 Zimbabweans killed in such an attack. And so this is a very serious problem. And I wanted to try to understand what it is that would drive a person to that point of violence. what makes them feel so strongly about protecting what is their own that they feel able to react aggressively and violently to another human being who just happens to come from a different place. And I think that we might not necessarily be xenophobic, but we are phobic towards others in certain ways. Maybe you have a neighbor who dresses like a goth and you don't like it. Or maybe you have someone from a different religion. I'm vegan. People always hate vegans. So maybe people have these opinions about vegans and they don't want to have me anywhere near them. So these are just simple ways in which I would like people to go away and interrogate their own thoughts and attitudes about the other, about those who are different to them.
You said, in I believe an interview with The Guardian after you were longlisted for the Booker, the most disheartening thing for me has been that there's been no interest in my writing or in publishing me in South Africa. And has that changed? I assume it's for political reasons because your book can be read as critical of the country's xenophobia, but also did the Booker Prize change that for the better or for the worse? Did it make it less likely for you to be published there or more?
It has had an impact, but what I will say is that it's a frustrating kind of thing where within South Africa, I had to wait to be recognized overseas before they would recognize me in South Africa. And even now, it's not, it's sort of because they've been forced to recognize me. There have been quite a few interviews and I've been to a couple of festivals, and now that I am, because as I said, I was living in Brazil, I moved back to South Africa at the start of this year. And now that I'm home, I am more involved in the literary scene, but it is very difficult. Getting published in South Africa is difficult. The readership is quite small. People are not spending money on books. And because I write literary fiction, that's not something that really appeals very widely. People would rather buy something more entertaining, whatever that might be, but more genre fiction, or often nonfiction sells quite well in South Africa as well, whereas literary fiction really struggles. And I think because also it's not easy literary fiction that I write, it is a little bit challenging and unsettling.
You are, I think, still in the process of receiving a PhD in history. Do you mind telling us what subject you're working on and whether or not you think it will ever inspire fiction?
My academic career is quite a strange one. I have a PhD in English literature, which I received a few years ago. And then last year, I started a PhD in history, but then because of the Booker longlisting, I was invited to join Stellenbosch University this year as a postdoctoral fellow at the research unit, the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past, and to work on the biography of an uncharted people project. The history PhD is on hold at the moment, and I've just leapt ahead and I'm doing a postdoc. And the exciting thing about why I was invited to join them is they're doing amazing research on slavery and emancipation in the Cape. So I was invited to actually write a novel based on or inspired by the research that they've been doing. So that's what I'm working on now. And it is quite extraordinary because I do a lot of research when I write. And so to have not only research available to me, but have people working on it as I am working on my novel, and to be able to go to them and say, hey, what have you found about this? Or even sometimes I can say, I saw this newspaper article from 1838. Have you seen it? And we're able to share and collaborate. And I'm loving the experience. And it is quite different. I didn't expect to find myself really associated with economics. I don't really know much. I'm very bad at budgeting my money, but I am finding it fascinating, and I'm very excited about the novel I'm working on.
Well, that is very interesting. I'm glad I asked. I'm sure many novelists are jealous of the idea of a research hive buzzing alongside them in real time, and we'll look forward to reading the final result. Karen Jennings, again, the novel is An Island. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize. It's available now, her first to be available in the United States. Karen, thanks for being here again to talk about it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Phil Klay is here, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. He won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2014 for his debut collection of short stories, Redeployment. He's also the author of the novel Missionaries, and his latest book is a collection of nonfiction, Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless, Invisible War. In the book review, James Fallows calls it engrossing and important. Phil, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel compelled to start, unfortunately, with a piece in your book called A History of Violence, because we're recording this just a few short days after the horrific events in the elementary school in Texas. And this is an essay that I'll let you walk us through. I'm curious why you wrote it and what inspired it and what kind of research you did for it.
It's an essay about the history of ballistics and firearms, both the technology of firearms and their marketing. And it starts with America's first convicted murderer, John Billington, who came on the Mayflower and whose weapon of choice was a gun, and moves to the present day, or to the Las Vegas shooter, anyway, who fired, 1,100 rounds in 10 minutes and killed scores of people. And the reason that I wrote it was because I'm interested throughout my work in Americans' relationship to violence in the military, ideas about those things, and also the technology and how the ideas and the technology interact. And firearms are a critical piece of that. And one of the things that is important for understanding where we are now is understanding the hardware, the mechanism, right? But also the software, the ways in which a civilian market and a civilian gun culture was grown. Oftentimes, people have this image of American history and the frontier as just sort of saturated with guns and violence, and this is how the West was won, and this is critical to American identity. And the actual historical record is a lot different. When Samuel Colt was developing his firearms, we know him as an inventor, but one of his really critical innovations was how to sell firearms and how to create a mythology around them. He didn't have much of a civilian market in the 1840s. At one point, he sold, I think, 10,000 guns to Texas. And that was it, because the Texas market was saturated at that point. That many guns wouldn't necessarily saturate one of Texas's smaller cities at this point. So he started a whole variety of things, from commissioning paintings and using what was called predicament advertisement, which was showing somebody in a difficult situation being attacked by animals or by American Indians and using guns to protect themselves. And that notion of guns as being your guarantor when you're going through unfriendly territory and dangerous places, that becomes wrapped up with a lot of American mythology. Other gun makers take up that idea. And after the Civil War, one of the advertising campaigns is Abraham Lincoln freed all men, but Samuel Colt made them equal. So instead of James Madison's all government rests on opinion, it's a kind of recasting of traditional American ideals as being tied directly to carrying a hunk of metal that is extremely efficient at killing people.
Having been in the military and around many people in the military, what is your sense of that mythos among those people who use this kind of hardware in combat and that mythos among civilians? And does it overlap much? And if so, where? What do you think military members, do you think that as a group, they see these things differently than the average person when it's in the news?
I mean, I knew a lot of people who carried firearms in their civilian life in the military. Military folks, a lot of them tend to be from more rural areas where there's more of a gun culture. But at the same time, I think that the way that you use weaponry in the military and kind of any sort of knowledge of how modern war happens, I think, changes the kind of romantic image. Guns are often talked about as our guarantor against tyranny. And yet, we don't actually allow the purchase of even the most basic weaponry that you would need to field a well-functioning militia, as is in the Second Amendment, light and medium machine guns and so on, because that would be just craziness. I mean, the kind of death tolls that you would have if we allowed that kind of armament would be extreme, even beyond the already extreme.
The book collects pieces from, I guess, about a decade of your writing. What do you think of as the organizing principle? Was there a particular reason that you did this now? And I'd also like you to take me through your thinking from, say, 2009 to 2020 about the wars overseas and whether there were gradual shifts or more sudden shifts in the way that you were thinking about them?
Absolutely. Yeah, when I started writing, I thought that I was going to be making sense of the past. And yet the wars kept going on. And the way that we fought them shifted. And I think that the end of ground troops in Afghanistan marks not an end to something, but rather the next chapter of something. Because one of the things that has happened over the time that I've been writing this is a shift from larger ground deployments, like the surge that I served in Iraq and Obama's surge to Afghanistan, to more use of special operations troops, mercenaries, drone strikes, airstrikes, all tools of warfare that are a lot less visible to the average American and which the government is not very transparent about. And so there was an incredibly raucous, cacophonous debate when I was in Iraq in 2007. General Petraeus and Ryan Crocker came in and testified before Congress, and there was grandstanding and vitriolic arguments and sort of, in many ways, democracy in action. The people making their voice known, their elected leaders making their voice known, sometimes with greater or lesser degrees of intelligence. But there was a real attempt to grapple with our wars abroad and the will of the American people versus what our leaders wanted. And then we began pulling troops out. And initially, Barack Obama had pulled troops out of Iraq and kind of ended the war there with great fanfare, only to have, during the rise of ISIS, this desire to start putting troops back in. And it was a difficult moment. And so rather than go before Congress and ask them to authorize the use of military force again, which would have been politically difficult, or at least alienated a part of the sort of more anti-war base that had helped him defeat Hillary Clinton in the primaries, he argued that the authorization for the use of military force that we passed in 2001 intended to be about Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, that could apply to ISIS, which didn't exist then. And the Obama administration leaned on that for a whole wide range of conflicts. I mean, just earlier in the Times, it was reported that Joe Biden had secretly made the decision to send more troops into Somalia, where they'll be continuing a long-running campaign of targeted assassination against al-Shabaab leaders. Why are we in Somalia? Why was that never voted on? Why has that happened so far out of the public view? Well, it's using the same authorization for the use of military force. And it's carried out by troops who don't admit journalists as embeds and don't provide a great degree of transparency. And we do things like that around the world. And so when Joe Biden pulled troops out of Afghanistan and declared the war that was over, but in the next breath announced that we would still continue to fight terrorism using over-the-horizon strikes, what he was really heralding was just a kind of full transition, I think, to that style of warfare. War done with more secrecy, with a lot of technology and special operations troops and very little transparency, and with the claim from our elected leaders that we're not at war, even though we're killing people.
You write often in the book about things like the idea of moral risk for people who are in war and the sense of veterans having a personal stake in war that maybe the average civilian has a hard time feeling or conceiving of. And the way you're speaking of it, is your opinion that special operations and drone strikes and these things that some argue make things less risky for quote unquote our side, do you think that they are on balance more problematic because of the things you're talking about, or is it that we need to wrestle with them more and be more transparent about them? How much would you look to, if you were in charge of things, to not use those things as much?
I don't necessarily have any problem with any individual tactic. And I'm not a pacifist. I'm not opposed to U.S. military presence. I've gone to northern Iraq and met with Syrian refugees who were furious that Donald Trump had pulled troops out of Syria, because what happened when he pulled troops out was Turkish-backed militias moved in and ethnically cleansed the region. And I spoke with a father in a tent in northern Iraq with pins all up and down his leg from a rocket attack, and his wife was pregnant and he had 2 little kids. And he was furious. He was furious because he felt that America had leaned on the Kurds to help fight ISIS and then just abandoned them. It's hard not to be sympathetic to that frustration. At the same time, though, I think that it creates huge problems of democratic accountability. I also think there's a huge problem when we're regularly sending troops to kill people and sending troops at risk, and the president is not forced on a regular basis to go before Congress to explain what the mission is, how it's in the national interest, what it's going to cost, what we're trying to achieve, what the benchmarks of success are supposed to be, so that we can judge whether or not the policy is working. I think that what happens when things happen so far out of the public view is that there's a kind of descent to that which is the least politically costly, rather than that which is the most morally serious. And I think that war is the most morally fraught thing that we can do as a nation, and it demands more democratic accountability. I also have great worries about a situation where we rely so heavily on kill capture. And I think most people don't understand the extent to which our kind of kill capture abilities have radically changed over the past 20 years.
Explain that term.
So 30 years ago, Delta Force, Navy SEALs were a couple of really tough guys with a few helicopters. During the Iraq War, we changed the way that we integrate intelligence services and operations in a tight loop. And one way of explaining the change is to point out that in 2004, in early 2004, Joint Special Operations Command, which is our special operations troops, they're doing about 6 raids a month. By 2006, they're doing around 300. So we're talking orders of magnitude more capability, something that Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said it was unprecedented. And so we have this extremely lethal ability to find people and to take them out. The most famous ones are Osama bin Laden, or Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who was killed by Donald Trump. But we're doing those kind of strikes all the time. And there's not a lot of oversight. Recent reporting by the Times revealed the extent to which there are much more civilian casualties than the Department of Defense reviews have admitted to, and that there's not much oversight or attempt to change procedure to ensure that there will be less. And I also just really worry about this attempt to deal with complex problems like unstable regions racked by political dysfunction and violence with the very blunt tool of targeted killings. I don't think it is in the long-term national interests of the United States if there are regions of the world where our primary interaction with the people who live there is when we come from the skies and kill people. Over time, I think that will cause problems for us, and I think that there needs to be more transparency about these kind of missions and more seriousness about our intent and what we're trying to achieve and whether it's worth it.
You write, speaking of transparency and accountability, about the idea of the military needing criticism, not just needing people's support and prayers, but a skeptical and critical audience in the public. How widespread is that feeling among soldiers or the top brass, and how much of it is just what you believe philosophically would improve things?
Well,
in other words, how many troops want a more critical audience?
It's interesting, right? Because my last book, Missionaries, was in many ways a novel about these things. And I think that, a novel is not a manifesto. It's a novel, but the portrait that it paints of this style of warfare is not in the least romanticized or particularly sympathetic. And yet a former Southern commander, a former commander of Special Operations Command, and Barack Obama all praised the book. So I think that at higher echelons, I think people know that there are serious issues with this style of warfare that need to be talked about. And more than that, there's the policy aspect of this. Part of the book is about veterans dealing with these things on a more sort of individual and personal level. And when you come home, there's a way in which very important things have happened to you, right? And I think we focus very narrowly on trauma sometimes, and that can be a part of it. But there's also a lot of very good experiences that people had in the military, and they have a sense of community and a sense of purpose and a whole host of other just kind of complex feelings that are bound up with service in a war, and also complex moral and spiritual issues that people might be working their way through. And we sometimes assume that the experience of war is incommunicable. I could never imagine what I've been through, a woman told me in a bar. But she told me that after she had been telling me that she felt better understood because of an article that I'd written. And the article was about seeing a Marine die and seeing civilian casualties and having a sense of shocked numbness. And shocked numbness was something that she knew well, because she had been through fairly severe abuse as a child. Now, my deployment was not particularly difficult. I was a staff officer. She was talking about things that were difficult to imagine happening to as an adult, let alone as a child. And yet she felt that communication was possible. And actually, that's something that I had written had touched a chord with her. And I think that being able to have difficult but tough conversations about war, yes, it's important on a policy level. And as citizens, these are our wars. Not only can we speak about them, but we must, and we can't be shut out of the conversation by generals or by veterans who think that they're only entitled to speak of war. But also at a deep personal level, if you hope to be understood, if you hope to actually get a grasp on what you've been through, because we don't understand what we've been through just on our own, but we understand it through conversation and communication with others, then I think we have to have more openness to difficult conversations and more openness to people who have not been to war, having some kind of perspective on it that is valuable and worthy.
One aspect of the alienation or the gap that exists between the military and civilians is this common idea, I think, that you talk about, having gone to an Ivy League school yourself and knowing other soldiers who did, this idea that sometimes civilians will act as if you made, as you write, some bizarre choice to spend time with the peons. And this idea that now the military, because we don't have the draft, is just a place where people who don't have many other options go, and it's almost a tax on the poor in a way, this horrific moral tax on the poor. You argue against that in the book, and you paint a very different picture. What would you say to people who believe that?
It just doesn't seem to be true, given everything that I've seen about who joins the military. So one of the studies that I reference looks at zip codes, and the least represented zip codes in the military are the poorest 20% and the richest 20%. And there's a bulge in the, I think it was like 5th, 6th, and 7th deciles. I might be slightly off, but more middle class than people often think. When I joined, I knew it was a moral choice. I knew that we were in Iraq. I knew that we were in Afghanistan. I had tried to think deeply about the wars, or at least as deeply as any relatively young kid does. And yeah, it mattered to me greatly that this was an active choice. And this is something that a lot of veterans have experienced. And to suggest that, oh, you're only joining the military during a time of war, when everybody's joining has the expectation that they might go to a combat zone, but you're only doing this because you have no other option. I think, aside from being not true, I think it's
condescending.
It's condescending, and it cuts out grappling with the kind of moral choice that is. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in that essay was think very deeply about what it means to join the military and what the relationship is between the citizen and the soldier. Because one of the peculiarities of coming home is what's happening in Iraq feels so different from walking through New York. I was talking to a journalist about going to New York on leave in the middle of my tour in Iraq, and he was like, oh, no, you never go to New York straight from Iraq, right? That's just too weird. And, I'm walking down the street, and it's a beautiful day, and there's people walking by in expensive clothes. And a week before, I'd seen a Marine die in a combat hospital. And there's just this bizarre thing, because that what is happening here in America is determining what's happening over there. And yet that connection feels so tenuous, even then, when there was a lot more engagement with the wars. And I think trying to make sense of that, this is an old war story. This is Odysseus coming back to Ithaca and not recognizing it and only being recognized by his dog. And there's something painful about that, obviously. But I think there's also something powerful and productive, because when you come back, it forces you to look at your country anew and to think very deeply, not just about that question, but about the obligations of citizenship and about the ideals that you signed up for or that you thought you were fighting for, and whether or not they're instantiated in your country and how they could be better instantiated. And, if you look at U.S. history, questions about war, they're never narrowly just about war. They become entwined with issues about immigration and race and firearms, as I've mentioned, at so many other aspects of American life. And I don't think that you can look at today's politics and totally disassociate it from the failures of our foreign policy and our wars.
You mentioned just a moment ago how young you were and how young, even younger, many people were when they signed up to go to war. And I believe, if my math is right, you were 17 or 18 years old on 9/11. I know that that's before you went to the military. So given that fact and given the length of these conflicts and your experience with them, I want to ask lastly about something you write in the book. You say, though the past 2 decades of American wars have destroyed the innocent idealism that initially inspired me to join the military, I'd like to think a different, tougher form of idealism remains. I'd like to combine that with thoughts about your faith, because I know you write about that in the book as well, and have written about that elsewhere. And just given the fact that you were a teenager just coming into your own on 9/11, and now 20 years later, you've been through all this. Where do you stand now in terms of idealism and faith, and what role do you think all of this has played in shaping that since it's been so concurrent?
I absolutely love this country, and that idealism very much remains. To my mind, patriotism is not a blinkered, defensive, uncritical spouting of cliches about this country. To my mind, patriotism is very much about the work that one does to sort of push America further to those ideals. Ralph Ellison talks about the sacred words like democracy and equality and freedom that we're always eating and regurgitating and eating again. If you look through American history, you see that process time and time again. And I think very much it's about the turbulence and the struggle to push America towards that better sense of itself. And that is the state of my idealism about America.
Is that something that you link to your faith or see mirrored in your faith?
I gave a talk once that became one of the essays in this book about my chaplain in Iraq, who, when there were mass casualty events, military triage goes into effect. And if you can't save someone, you make them comfortable, but you leave them aside and you focus on the people whose lives can be saved. But you never want anybody to just die alone, and particularly not, for example, children. And my chaplain, Chaps McLaughlin, a really wonderful man, took it upon himself to minister to children as they were dying. And eventually the engineers bought him rocking chairs, and he would rock them and hold them as they died. I talked about his struggles with faith and war during that time and my own. And after the talk, a veteran stood up and he said he was a veteran of Afghanistan. And he said, I stopped believing in God after I came back from Afghanistan. And it made it easier because it meant that there were questions that I didn't have to ask. And I think that my hope, anyway, is that for me, faith is about trying to ask some of those very painful questions and trying to push deeper into, I think, the kind of mysteries at the heart of human experience that war sometimes brings to the fore simply because of its intensity and because of the moral stakes involved.
Well, the book is very searching, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. Phil Klay, again, the new book is Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War. Phil, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'm joined now by two of the Times' book critics, Dwight Garner and Alexandra Jacobs, to talk about the things they've recently reviewed. Hi, you two.
Hey, John.
Hi, John.
Dwight, let's start with you. You reviewed a juicy-ish biography.
Yeah, it's a short book about Phil Mickelson, the golfer, Tiger Woods' great rival. And it was written by Alan Shipnuck, a fellow who's written a long time for Sports Illustrated and Golf Magazine. He's been around. And it's a short book, and it's got a thesis. Its thesis is that even though Phil Mickelson seems like, in many respects, this great person, he sort of has this dark underside, Shipnuck argues. As many people know, there was a big controversy recently when Mickelson was among the people trying to set up a new rival golf tour in Saudi Arabia, and he seemed to skate over that country's human rights record, and it made him seem quite a dark figure. And he's, matter of fact, ever since then, he hasn't played on the PGA Tour. He's sort of been out wandering. But the book covers, all sides of Mickelson's career. And it's funny, I got a ton of mail after I wrote this review because I referred at one point, someone mentions Phil Mickelson's Eddie Haskell grin. And of course, I remember Eddie Haskell was on Leave It to Beaver, and I watched The Beav to some extent when I was a kid, but I didn't know what a Eddie Haskell grin meant. And I admitted in my review, I had to look it up. Do you guys know what that means?
No.
Nope.
I sort of felt like I knew, but I didn't. It means a devilish grin, a two-faced grin. And I guess Mickelson has one of the killer Eddie Haskell grins in contemporary culture. But people were shocked. I had to look it up. I mean, I'm 57, so I grew up watching TV in the late 70s, mid 70s, but I just didn't watch enough Beav.
He does have that kind of baby face with the dimples where you think nobody can be that innocent.
Yeah. I mean, he grew up in San Diego. His father was a pilot. His father was also a golf fanatic. So Mickelson grew up with a big green, a putting green in his backyard and room to hit sort of long shots in the backyard as well. And he was just this nerdy golfer from the time he was really young. He wore the popped polo collars and a visor. And, he was handsome and he always had the cutest girlfriend. And even though he was kind of nerdy, he went to school at Arizona State University and then he went into the pros. And he was this guy who was set up to be the next Jack Nicklaus or Arnold Palmer. And then 4 years later, along comes Tiger Woods. And suddenly Phil Mickelson is the secondhand guy for the rest of his life. And this book is an interesting look at how he's dealt with that life and career.
It's funny, you mentioned him as the great rival to Tiger, and I was thinking about Andy Roddick, the tennis player, was once asked about his rivalry with, I believe, Roger Federer, and he kind of jokingly said, would you call it a rivalry? He had lost 18 of 19 matches or something. But obviously he was the kind of clear number two to Tiger for a while. What does Shipnuck get into in terms of the Saudi Arabia thing? I'm a pretty big sports fan, but I haven't followed that story that closely. And my sense is that, like you said, has he become persona non grata among his fellow players?
A little bit. He apologized briefly, and then he sort of dropped off the planet, and people are waiting for his comeback. This book picks at the Saudi Arabia stuff. It picks at Mickelson. He's an enormous gambler. I mean, he gambles so heavily that he once said to a friend that his bets move the line. He does it on football mostly, but also sometimes on golf. It gets interesting. He skates this line between it being illegal and unethical. Again, you go back to the Eddie Haskell stuff. There's this sense that some players just think he's a jerk, that he's two-faced, that Eddie Haskell way, and other people don't think so at all. And so I wrote in my review that I ended up in the end liking Mickelson more than I liked him going into the book. He seems very game. He seems like he has a lot of fun, and he seems like he has conversation. He doesn't seem like this driven. Tiger Woods is, as I wrote in my review, has this Undertaker-like authority, and he comes on and he's all business. Mickelson is this kind of wise guy, and he seems to enjoy his life.
So my last question for you, Dwight, is that the genre of unauthorized biography, as I'm sure you know, and this one exclamatorily sets off the unauthorized part in its subtitle on the cover. They often have a kind of tabloidish feel to them, and yet Shipnuck, like you said, is a longtime Sports Illustrated writer and is a pretty legit guy. What is the tone of the book like? Does it stoop low to get the juice, or is it only unauthorized because he didn't have Phil's blessing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was a bit disappointed in the level of the writing. I mean, Shipnuck can clearly write, but the book reads like a quickie, and it's got this kind of wise guy tone. If a guy's tough, Shipnuck will write, he's tough as a $2 steak. And that kind of just, it's just like wise guy detective fiction from the 30s tone sometimes. And the middle part bogs down. One of the hardest things in sports books is to describe matches. And the middle third of this book is all just Goosen bogeyed 14 while Mickelson birdied 13 and 15, and you're reading about these. And the one book I've read that does a great job of that is Andre Agassi's biography. Well, somehow he walks through match after match, tennis match, and it's just electric. But this book, not so much. But as I write in my review, this book was for me an okay day waster.
An okay day waster. Okay. Yeah. I'm feeling like that's 2 to 2.5 stars out of 5 or something like that. Yeah. We'll figure it out. Alexandra, speaking of people who are tough as $2 steaks, presumably, you reviewed a memoir this week.
I did review a memoir, John. Yes. I reviewed Kellyanne Conway's memoir, which is called Here's the Deal, which I thought was an interesting title considering that her former boss's famous book is The Art of the Deal. I think the title just indicates I'm going to give you the straight dope, which Kellyanne Conway is not generally known for.
For people who just caught the red eye from Saturn, let's remind them briefly about her role in the previous administration.
Absolutely. Kellyanne Conway was senior counselor to President Donald Trump. She started out as, I think, assistant to the president, which is, despite sounding like a secretary, is a very high up, intimate position where you get direct access. She was one of his closest advisors throughout the administration. And I think some people actually believed her to be his spokeswoman because she so frequently appeared on television, because she had a big background in television, as did he, of course, which is one of the things they have in common.
What is her tone toward Trump? I guess let's start there and then we'll go to the rest.
Her tone toward Trump is admiring. Other memoirs, I think this is the second memoir out of the Trump administration I've reviewed. Yes, the first was Stephanie Grisham's. Other memoirs express being enthralled and then eventually disenchanted, or the other ones I've looked at, a feeling of compromise or hope or whatever, and then disenchantment. There's not disenchantment here.
No regrets.
Regrets about the election that Biden won, but not regrets about other things that happened.
Does she offer a full-throated defense of Trump's positions and presidencies, or does she just make it clear that she doesn't regret anything and then tell the rest of her story? I
wouldn't call it full-throated. I'd call it partial-throated. I mean, it's very selective in what it chooses to highlight from the administration. I was much more interested in Kellyanne Conway's origin story because I hadn't really studied it or known about it before, except most glancingly. And as with most memoirs, that's the part I found held my attention most closely. Not the stuff about the administration, which I thought was pretty dizzying spin.
What is the origin story and how does she tell it?
I find it so interesting. I mean, she really has it out for feminists, in their pink pussy hats and their yoga pants and all that. And yet the story of Kellyanne Conway is one of, she sort of begins saying, oh, I should have been a feminist. I should have been marching with the pink hats because she was raised by 4 women in a tiny town in New Jersey called Atco. And her father left the family and she was an only child. And she really had these models of very strong women. She has many female friendships. Also, the book really goes on and on a lot about sexism and how men are not giving her due and this and that, and particularly when it comes to her husband, George Conway. I got a little hate mail for this, but I compared her at one point to, and this was a bit of a mad comparison, but maybe because she was in a town in New Jersey that was oriented toward Philadelphia, I thought of the Philadelphia story, and I thought of Kellyanne Conway as sort of this reverse image of Tracy Lord in Philadelphia story, where she's torn between 2 men. She's torn between George Conway and Donald Trump because her loyalty to her boss is complete. And there's George Conway out tweeting against the administration pretty early on. Of all the people who knew I was reading this book, that was what people were most interested in. What the heck's going on with her husband?
What does she say is going on? Does she pull back the curtain?
She expresses nothing but bafflement at his behavior online. I mean, she really makes a case, an anti-social media case. Spoiler alert, she says that their marriage may not last, that they may not survive as a couple.
I mean, if they made it through the administration, I would think that that's...
You think, right? I mean, the thing is, Kellyanne Conway's a Catholic, and I think the marriage is important to her. I believe in the marriage. They have 4 children. Claudia Conway also went rogue on social media. I think that Kellyanne Conway is an absolutely amazing compartmentalizer, and that is evident from this book.
You say that she's a Catholic. She's also, I think, like anybody of either party in her position, she's a performer of sorts. And so I guess my takeaway question is, how much of this memoir do you buy?
I bought her origin story. Anytime she went into politics or policy or her experience in her job, anytime she veered away from the personal, I felt like I have to go to the tape or go to other accounts or whatever. I needed to be balanced. I really felt it's important to know where people in politics come from. And for that, I found this book very valuable.
Okay, well, valuable for those reasons, and I think skeptical for others, and people can go online to read your full review to get your take on the book.
Indeed, they can.
Let's go over again the books you reviewed.
I reviewed Here's the Deal by Kellyanne Conway.
And I reviewed Phil, the rip-roaring and unauthorized biography of golf's most colorful superstar by Alan Shipnuck.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.